So, is a caterpillar good or evil? Is a butterfly right or wrong? Well, it's not really a category, a question of right or wrong. When you're talking about caterpillars and butterflies, you're talking about one at the right time, which then transforms, metamorphosizes into the other. You need to have caterpillar in order eventually to get to butterfly. We're going to have a similar conversation as we take a look at what Paul says the role of the law is, and then the coming of Christ in this conversation on Freed for Love. So as we turn now to the 4th chapter of Galatians, we've been noticing Paul has taken what at first might sound like a really strong anti-law position, right? Paul has said things like, we were never in right relationship with God because of our ability to follow the laws or the commandments, or for the ancient people of Israel to be circumcised or keep the kosher laws. It's always been grace through faith, trust in a promise. He spent an awful lot of time in the 3rd chapter pointing out the story of Abraham was really a story of trusting a promise, not of keeping laws or following rituals. So it could be really easy to think that Paul's saying law equals bad, faith equals good, and making these sort of opposites. And that's not really what Paul has in mind. Paul's come back around now to say, okay, I've made the case that God has always been in relationship with human beings simply on the basis of trusting a promise, on grace that we don't earn or deserve by our good deeds or rule following or ritual practice. But then that begs the question, then why was there the law in the first place, right? If Abraham is put into relationship with God because he trusts God's promise, why then for centuries does ancient Israel live with the Torah as its way of life, with the commandments and the unique laws and commandments that were its way of life? And Paul's going to do an interesting thing. Instead of making these opposites, one is good, one is bad, law is evil and faith is good or something like that. That's the mistake we sometimes make, especially, let's be honest, Lutheran Christians, sometimes making it sound like New Testament God is nice, Old Testament God is all about law. No. Paul has a sense that it's more about a progression through time that has everything to do with our need. Paul in Galatians 4 uses this metaphor, this way of talking, and he says, when children are little, they are, under the guidance or direction of, say, a teacher or a disciplinarian, or in the ancient Roman household, there might have been a servant or slave in the house, a pedagogue, whose job was like the instruction and corralling of children and keeping them in line, sort of like a governess maybe in Mary Poppins or Sound of Music, right? And their job is both to keep the kids in line, scold them when necessary, and some kind of instruction, right? So Paul has said that the law's role is like that there was a point in history where God's people were in that sort of childhood phase that needed that guidance and needed the law to be that disciplinarian, that guardian, that governess, so to speak. And that's always been time-bound until the point came in human history, in cosmic history even, when God finally puts things right by coming among us in the Messiah, in the promised one. So Paul makes a similar move in Galatians 4. He says, when we were like little children, we were bound to the powers of the world, but when the fullness of time came, God came along and entered human history. God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to set us free, so that now insiders and outsiders, Jewish people, Gentile people, could all be brought into this new community and be adopted as children. The move that Paul makes isn't to say the law was bad, it was a terrible mistake, and we never should have had it. But he also doesn't say, God used to save people by following the rules, and then God changed God's mind, but more to say, it's always been about grace through faith. It's always been about trusting a promise, but there's a time when God's people need the guardrails of having the law and the commandments to sort of shape their communal way of life. And now that Christ has come, Some of those things we can recognize were time-bound. The same way, maybe, you might say there are boundaries and rules for young children. And yeah, they have to follow the directions of, say, a babysitter or a school teacher or a nanny who comes to watch them. There are times when other people are brought in who are not the parents, who have oversight, who are in loco parentis, and whose job is to discipline or instruct or guide or guard the children. And they may even have the ability to give them consequences. Their belonging in the family doesn't depend on how well you listen to the nanny or the teacher or the babysitter, but you do have to live within the boundaries they set for a time until you come of age, until the time when there's clarity again, when either the children age up or mom and dad come home from their date night or you come home from school. That sense of being time-bound means that the law wasn't bad, but it was limited. It could never do what God, from the vantage point of being the parent, could do. Paul's point isn't to say the law is evil or wicked, but more to say the law has limits. The same way a babysitter may have some things they can do and also a lot of things a babysitter can't do for you, right? They can watch you for a night and make sure you don't eat too much pizza and make sure you get to bed on time, but they can't hug you when you're tired or sick or stay up with you in the night, right? There's those kind of limits. In a similar way, Paul says the overarching story is of God who brings us into the family, and that there was a time when the law's role was to help put guardrails up, guidelines for how God's people were to live, but those are always meant to point us to the coming of God in Christ. Paul sees that as the law doing the most the law could do, and to expect more of it is to misunderstand what the law could do, right? Like we said before in our conversation last week, the most a law or a rule can do is basically yell at you when you mess up. Do this or don't do that. And it can yell till it's blue in the face. And if I'm open to listening to correction, that might help remind me and sort of keep me on my toes. But if my problem is something deeper than that, just yelling at me to follow rules can't make me follow the rules. Instead, we need something deeper. So, as we head further into Galatians, we're going to continue to explore how Paul sees these two relationships between the law and the way of faith and the way the followers of Jesus live in the tension of the two of them, especially remembering that in Paul's mind is the concern about how do we welcome all these outsiders, these Gentile people who've come to faith and dare to believe they're welcome as they are. They don't have to stop being Gentile. They're welcome as they are, as Gentiles, to come and follow Jesus. And for Paul to say that's not a mistake on our part as Christians or the church making a mistake or losing its morals or grounding, that's living into how God has always brought people into relationship. We want to invite you to keep being a part of our in-person Bible study, walking through Galatians. Join us on Thursdays at 1 o'clock here at Community of Christ. Or if you can't make it, catch up in these video summary series. We hope you can join us along the way as we continue exploring what it means to be freed for love. See you later.